All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here on time, and thanks again for being flexible and having our class online today. I know it's not ideal, so I appreciate everyone's flexibility with that. Looks like you'll be having some online classes tomorrow or no classes tomorrow, so stay safe and warm out there. As with all of our lectures, I will record this and I will post the video on the class YouTube channel shortly after we're done this afternoon. The easiest thing, if you have questions at any point, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. You can put a comment in the chat as well. And if the comment is in the chat and I'm not seeing it, feel free to just let me know. Sometimes when I'm lecturing, it's hard to keep track of everything. So don't be afraid to unmute yourself and jump in. In advance of class today, you had some article summaries to read, a handful of summaries of peer-reviewed papers in the recent literature to read and come to class prepared to discuss. And also, no, actually that was it. And then the survey for Life in Cold Blood is on there as well, but we haven't finished that yet. I just want to see, before we dive into today's activities, what questions you have for me about what's going on in class. Okay, a couple other notes as well is I graded all of your responses to the reflection questions on bufology. You can see those grades are now available in Blackboard. And also I will return your quizzes on Monday next week. So I have them graded. However, there's still a couple people in the class that are going to take the quiz, so I don't want to give them back. And I have a general policy of not giving grades back without actually giving the quiz or exam back with it. I think it's not very helpful for you just to get a number back without having any idea where you earned or didn't earn points. So plan on Monday next week getting those back along with your test, along with your score for that. All right, so with that in mind, I got some feedback from some of you on the anonymous poll, which I appreciate, that said I should move faster through these lectures. Just kidding, that I should move slower through the lecture material, especially when we're online. So I'm going to make a concerted effort to do that today. If I'm not doing that well, feel free to just give me a shout and say, hey, slow down. Or remember that all of this will be recorded and posted, so you can always go back and pause on a slide to get an image or something like that. So today we're picking up with reptile diversity, part 2. We started off talking about reptile diversity on Monday with snakes. We're going to finish up snakes and continue on our squamate adventure. So today's class looks like this. We'll start off with the reptile diversity lecture. And then we're going to do an activity in small groups with those article summaries you read in advance of class today. And then I'm going to wrap things up. So again, when we have class online, I will structure things so we're not online here for an extended period of time, meaning an hour and 50 minutes is just way too long. What we'll do is we'll do the lecture, we'll take a short break, and then we will we'll do that group activity. So let me actually adjust one thing. If you just bear with me here for one quick second to make an adjustment. I just need to fix one thing in my lecture notes here, and then we'll be ready to go. Oops, just kidding. Okay, here we are. So let's go ahead and dive in. This is review from last lecture, just to refresh your memory about the general information about extant reptiles. Remember that extant means living. It's the opposite of extinct. We have 4 primary groups that we're going to discuss. One is Rincocephalia or Tuatara. There's only one species left from this group in the world. We'll also talk about crocodilians and turtles next week. And we started in Squamata last class, and we will work through Squamata, including lizards and snakes today. Now, note that I have the number of species in each group here. Again, I want to remind you that I don't need you to know these exact numbers. Well, maybe for Tuatara, you can know that there's one species of Tuatara. For the others, the exact number isn't important. What is important is that there's a couple dozen species of crocodilia, several hundred species of turtle, and 10,000 plus species of squamata, meaning that the vast majority of reptile species are squamates and are in this group that includes lizards, snakes, and amphisbaenians. So they are by far and away the most diverse group of reptiles. They also exhibit the greatest variation in things like life history traits or physiology. They have the broadest geographic distribution, extending up from deserts and tropical regions up into the Arctic Circle. It's truly an incredible group of vertebrates. And that'll be our continuing focus with our lecture today. So we're going to refresh your memory about the terrestrial vertebrate phylogeny. I'll just walk you through a little bit of this, some review. On the top here, this is what you drew, ideally, on your quiz on Monday, the relationship between salamanders and frogs and caecilians. Couple refreshers, remember that the term amphibian is the group amphibians is monophyletic, meaning that it includes the most recent common ancestor of all of these surviving groups, which could be found at this node right here, and all of its descendants. Importantly, notice that salamanders and frogs are sister taxa, and that caecilians is the outgroup. That means that salamanders or frogs are more closely related to each other than either is to caecilians. And at the same time, they're both equidistantly related to caecilians. So salamanders are just as closely related to caecilians as a frog or a toad is to caecilians. Notice on this branch as well that this group amphibians, this whole clade here, forms the outgroup to this whole group here, which includes mammals and what we consider reptiles, including birds. So we've got amphibians as the sister group to all of these other vertebrates. Notice that in this group of vertebrates, in this clade, mammals is the sister group to all of the other reptiles. We'll get into a little more detail about the relationship between birds and crocodilians and specifically dinosaurs in an upcoming lecture on the age of dinosaurs, where we'll cover a lot of extinct groups. But for now, what I want you to focus on is this relationship between snakes and lizards, Squamata, and Tuatara. Notice that they are sister taxa, meaning that squamates are more closely related to Tuatara than they are to any of the other reptile groups. And notice that these guys, this group that includes what's called, you don't need to know this, but this group is called Lipidosuria, and this is the group that includes squamates and Tuatara. They are sister to the group that includes turtles, birds, and crocodiles. So again, this means that birds are more closely related to crocodiles and turtles than they are to any snake or lizard or Tuatara. And to hone in a little more, we're going to focus on our squamates today. And I want to show you this big phylogeny of squamates. Now, again, this is a review. I covered this exact slide on Monday. Just want to refresh your memory, make sure we're hammering this home. Super big, complicated phylogeny here. The takeaway message is that what we commonly call lizards, I have it in quotation marks intentionally, are paraphyletic with respect to both snakes and amphisbaenians, meaning that snakes and amphisbaenians are, in an evolutionary sense, simply highly derived lizards. Now, we treat snakes a little bit differently because they are this very specialized lineage and they have many highly derived characteristics that sets them off from lizards. However, it's really important to note that snakes are more closely related to some lizards, for example, skinks, than skinks are to other lizards, for example, iguanas or other lizards in this group. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Also note that what we commonly call snakes is monophyletic. So snakes, the group that we call snakes includes all of the living species and their from the most recent common ancestor down, it includes all of those living species that are most closely related to each other than they are to anything else on this tree. So that's the big takeaway message from this phylogeny. I also talked about, oops, sorry, I skipped a slide, the squamata, some general information that includes lizards and snakes. Lizards paraphyletic with respect to snakes, we just talked about that. A couple noteworthy things about this group as well is that they do have these paired copulatory organs called hemipenes. And also it's important to note that just because a squamate doesn't have legs doesn't mean it's a snake. It could be any number of lizard lineages. It could be an amphisbaenian, could be a snake. Also, I just have the word tail here. It's kind of a funny note here, tail. Yes, they all have tails. And what's important to note is that the size of that tail can vary greatly. And generally speaking, snakes actually have really short tails, which is surprising to a lot of people because they think the whole body is the tail. But in fact, they have relatively shorter tails relative to their body than many lizard species do. Here in Ohio, we are lucky enough to have 5 lizards. I should have actually put 6, and I'll tell you why. I'll show you in a slide coming up why I should have put 6 or maybe 5/6 lizards and 28 snake species here. Now, I almost finished up snakes on Monday. I had just a few more details I wanted to cover, but let me pause here and make sure this all sounds good and see what questions you have before we get into some specifics about snake families here in Ohio and some example species from those families. All right, the thoughts that go through my mind when nobody has questions are very polar. On one hand, I'm the world's greatest teacher, and I just explain things so thoroughly there's no room for questions. On the other end of the spectrum, nobody gives a shit. And so I think reality is probably somewhere in between there, but it's a little disconcerting to bounce back and forth those two interpretations of no questions. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know what's going on inside my brain, because that's important. All right, so let's, I skipped a slide here. Last Monday, last lecture, I left things off talking about snakes and some of their physical characteristics. The slide, I did cover this slide, but I want to just reiterate it. One identifying feature for snakes can be whether they have what's called smooth or keeled scales. Smooth scales, keeled scales have this ridge that goes down the middle. You can see it very clearly, well defined here, whereas smooth scales do not. One family here in Ohio that does have very keeled scales and some other important identifying characteristics is the family Viperidae. These are snakes commonly called vipers, as you might guess. There's a number of species throughout the world, again, ranging from the Arctic Circle. There are vipers that live up in the Arctic Circle through the tropics, deserts, and here in Ohio, we have a couple species in this group. I see a hand up. I'll get to it in 1 second. The example that I'm sharing with you here is Crotalus horridus, the timber rattlesnake. And I'll talk more about this group in timber rattlesnakes specifically here in a second. But Sid has a question. Go ahead, Sid.
Yeah, okay, so sorry. You said keeled scales just have the line going through them?
Yeah, they have this ridge right down the center of each scale. Oops, sorry. Each scale has this ridge going down. And you can actually see this very clearly when you find, for example, a shed of a snakeskin. You can see this very clearly, and it gives you some information about what snake might have left that skin behind. Did that answer your question, Sid?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. And I see a question in the chat. Do we ever discuss lizard scales as smooth and keeled? Not really. Lizard scales exhibit a lot more variation than snake scales, and they basically exhibit a lot more complex patterns, and so it's not as useful of an identifying characteristics. It can be used in some cases, but in general, it's not quite as useful. And so, great question. Is there an evolutionary advantage to keeled scales? I love this. Functional morphology, right? So how does the shape of the scale affect the snake's ability to do something? The answer is that it basically creates friction as a snake moves. And in some cases, friction can be beneficial if you're kind of moving in such a way that pushing off the substrate helps you get through it. Smooth scales in opposition don't create as much friction. They're smoother, right? And so a lot of, for example, arboreal snakes will be smooth scale that allows them to kind of glide more easily without getting caught on things, versus often terrestrial snakes might have keeled scales that help them get better traction in certain environments. Now that's a generalization. I'm not saying that all arboreal snakes are smooth or all terrestrial snakes are keeled, but that's one potential reason that explains that variation. And then I see lots of good questions coming in here. Great, this is great. Do all snakes versus lizards have one or the other? We can talk about that with snakes, although there is variation in keeledness, or whatever you would call it, the amount of keel that you see in the scales, but you can classify them as keeled or unkeeled. Lizards, as I mentioned in response to Ethan's questions, are just a bit more, they're more complicated. Yeah, and so Ethan put in the chat here, don't keeled scales allow snakes to attract more dew to their skin as well to drink? There are some species specialized to very arid desert environments that can actually position themselves in certain places at certain times of day. I have an article about this actually for later in the semester. We'll get to it. But what they can do is they position themselves, and their body is shaped in such a way that it optimizes the condensation that forms on them. And then they can actually kind of channel that to their mouths and drink it. In places where there's no standing water to drink. And the shape of those scales can assist with that for sure, yeah. So they can play different roles in different situations as well. Some snakes can actually make a noise by rubbing their scales together in a certain way. So they're highly, you can do a lot with a keeled scale. There's my quote for the day. You can do a lot with a keeled scale. Good, great questions. All right, so this example of a snake with keeled scales is the rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes, now this is going to be a bit of a surprise to everyone, can be easily identified by the presence of a rattle on their tail. And let me tell you a quick and true story. When I was a graduate student at Iowa State University, every year for 4 or 5 years, I was the teacher of the herpetology lab, which is great. And half of the labs for herpetology were field outings. And the last field outing that we would go on in October was always this big deal, because there was this private quarry near Des Moines, Iowa, where there was this pretty robust population of these timber rattlesnakes. And in fact, they were some of the largest timber rattlesnakes recorded. Apparently, in this environment, they ate a lot of rabbits, where for the most part, they eat smaller rodents. And so there's just these really big, beautiful timber rattlesnakes. And we would take the class there on a field trip every year. Every year that I went, we saw a rattlesnake. It was spectacular. Now, as you can imagine, we spent a lot of time before we'd go on this outing preparing the class not only for etiquette of field outings and safety generally, but also for the fact that there would be rattlesnakes there and some safety measures that are important when you're working around venomous and potentially dangerous animals. Well, one year, one of the students, to make a long story short, decided to pick up a rattlesnake. So the student saw a rattlesnake on the ground and said, hey, there's a snake. We've been catching snakes in class. I'm going to catch that one. They bent over, they picked up the snake, they showed it to one of their classmates. The classmate said, hey, that snake's got a rattle. That's a rattlesnake. So somebody paid attention in class. The student who picked up the snake said, oh, put the snake back down. The snake didn't do anything. The snake never rattled. The snake obviously didn't bite her. The other people on the trip ended up coming over and seeing the snake against the tree. It wasn't until after the fact that I found out what happened. And this is corroborated by a number of people. So fascinating story about snakes and human psyche. Also, takeaway message, don't pick up rattlesnakes. Not a good idea. They have long fangs and they can and will bite, except for this one friendly Iowa snake. He was Midwestern friendly, I guess. Okay, so snakes in this family Viperidae live in a diversity of habitats. So I want to emphasize here that I'm speaking about snakes in this family generally, not the timber rattlesnake. I'm showing this as an example of the snake in Ohio, but here these characteristics are about the family as a whole. They can be arboreal or terrestrial. We find a lot, especially in the tropics, that are tree dwelling. Most of them are viviparous, meaning they give live birth, and very cool, interestingly, they often exhibit parental care. So, for example, timber rattlesnakes, the moms will give live birth, usually sometime in September, and then those little tiny baby rattlesnakes that are adorable, but don't pick them up, will hang out with mom for the rest of that season through hibernation. We actually had the fortune on our trips of occasionally seeing a mom with a bunch of her babies, and they are adorable, and it is fantastic, and it's really cool. Reptiles aren't really known for exhibiting this kind of having these intraspecific interactions, so one species interacting with that same species, and especially aren't famous for their parental care, but this is one counter example to that. These guys are venomous. They have what's called selenoglyphous fangs. We'll talk about this more when we talk about venom, but for now I want you to know that selenoglyphous fangs are basically the longest kind of snake fang, and they're the fangs that are in front and they're hinged, meaning that when the rattlesnake closes its mouth, they're kind of back, and then it opens its mouth, they hinge forward, and so they can be very long. They essentially act like hypodermic needles in that they're hollow and they can inject the venom right through that hole in the middle of the fang to inject it in their prey, or in some cases to avoid a potential predator. Vipers also have these heat pits or facial pits that are very sensitive to heat, as you might guess from the name, and they can, at a very fine scale, detect infrared radiation, which allows them to hunt, for example, at night. Most of them have keeled scales. They have these kind of telltale triangular heads, kind of a giveaway for vipers, although other snakes will imitate that. And you can see in the image here and other images, they have this vertically elliptical pupil. So their eye is kind of this vertical slit. Now, I did go over that on Monday. That's where we left off. I'm just kind of reviewing a little bit to get us up to speed. Also making sure that everyone's got this information and I'm going at a good pace here. So bear with me. However, that is the last of our repeat information. I want to talk a little bit about here in Ohio and give an example of two snakes that are very commonly confused. And those snakes are Nerodiacipidon, or the northern water snake. This is a harmless, I shouldn't say that, it's a non-venomous snake in the family Colubridae. So it's in the family, it's most closely related to garter snakes and other snakes like that. It is not venomous. However, they're very feisty. As you will find out later in the semester, we have a nice population of these guys that lives right here on the OWU campus. You can see these guys on the left. And on the right, we see a Copperhead, Enkystrodon contortrix. These guys are venomous. They're in the family of Viperidae. So I gave you earlier in the class, I gave you examples of snakes from Ohio in different families. I used the common garter snake, Thamnophis sertalis, as the example in the family Colubridae. Here's another one for you, Nerodiacipidon. And also in the family Viperidae, I gave the example of a timber rattlesnake. Here I'm giving you the example of the Copperhead, Enkystrodon contortrix. These guys are often confused for each other, which leads to the unfortunate and unnecessary death of many northern water snakes. Northern water snakes generally have an oval-shaped head. However, when they are fending off a predator, they will pull their head back, and you can kind of see it here. I should have included a better picture, and make their head look very, very triangular in imitation of the Copperhead. Now, this is a great example of Apostemitism. So I gave the example on Monday in class of aposematic coloration, when a non-toxic or non-dangerous organism imitates the coloration of a potentially toxic organism. So we talked about examples in oh no, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up my terms. Back up. Aposematism is when you're advertising the fact that you're dangerous or venomous, so that other organisms know that you pack a punch, and if they mess with you, they're going to get punished. So, for example, the bright red coloration of the red eft, or the bright colors of, say, a poison dart frog. That is aposematism, basically signaling that you are potentially dangerous, so back off. Earlier in class, we learned about something called Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is when a non-dangerous organism imitates a dangerous one so that a potential predator thinks it's dangerous. And that's exactly what these water snakes do. They pull their head back and make it look like a triangle, like a viper. It's a form of Batesian mimicry to make them look more like vipers. So a potential predator is going to say, oh, that's a viper. I'm not going to mess with it. Sorry, I didn't mean to get that confused with aposematism there at the beginning. They also have this kind of unique color pattern where they have these blotches on their dorsum. You can see them right down here, and these blotches on their side, but they're offset. Notice that the blotches aren't continuous across from the back to the side, whereas in the Copperhead, you can see very nicely here, they have these continuous blotches. Water snakes don't have heat pits. Again, Copperheads do. They're in the family of Viperidae, so you can see right here between its nostril and its eye, this big old these heat pits. And finally, these water snakes have very strongly keeled scales, and the Copperheads have keeled scales, but much more weakly so. Now, you've got a snake in front of you, and you're like, oh, I'm going to see if this is a Copperhead or a water snake. You're probably not going to bend down too close to look at the keeled scales. I just want you to know that as an identifying character. How you can best identify these guys from a distance is probably this color pattern. You've got this hourglass kind of continuous blotch on the side of the Copperhead, whereas you have these offset blotches on the water snake. You can also look at the shape of the head and some other characteristics as well. The shape of the pupil and the eye. Copperheads have this vertical elliptical pupil, whereas water snakes, like other colubrids, other snakes in the family Colubridae, have like a circular pupil and some other characteristics, but that's the general way to be able to tell them apart. So questions coming in. What family was Nerodiacipidon? Okay, so let me just, actually, I'll write this right in the chat. So Nerodiacipidon, this is why I like being in class. I could write stuff on the chalkboard. I'm going to put in family Colubridae. And that's the same as the garter snake that I mentioned earlier in class. Yeah, and then Ethan's got that there. Perfect. Thank you. So now you've got two examples of Ohio snakes in the family Colubridae and two examples in the family Viperidae. I'm going to pause here. Our next slide is getting into lizards. I'm just going to see what questions you have. Make sure you get information on these slides as well.
Sorry, I got confused in the middle there. So the that one you just said, that's in Colubridae, but the other one is in Viperidae, correct?
That is correct. So Nerodiacipidon, the northern water snake that you see on the left here, is in the family Colubridae, which is those, at least where we are, they are non-venomous snakes, including garter snakes and brown snakes and things like that. There are poisonous colubrids. We'll get to that later in the semester. The Copperhead is in the family of Viperidae, so same family as your timber rattlesnakes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question. I'm glad you asked that to make sure we've all got that information. All right, let's talk about lizards. Lizards are a super diverse group of squamate reptiles, and in fact, one of the most diverse groups of vertebrates. We need to say lizards in quotation marks. Remember, they are paraphyletic with respect to snakes and amphisbaenians. But these lizards, as we'll commonly call them, consist of 26 different families. You will not need to know all of these families. I just want to put the list up here to show you how diverse of a group they are. You will be responsible for knowing 6 of these families, 4 of which have representatives here in Ohio, and 2 of which are interesting and you've probably heard of. And I want to just give you a little more information about some lizards that live in other places in the world. So the 3 families where we'll find lizards in Ohio include Iguanidae, Geckonidae, there's 4 families here in Ohio: Iguanidae, Geckonidae, Lacertidae, and Skinkidae. Now, 2 of those groups are actually only have 1 species here in Ohio that's invasive. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So historically, there's only been 2 families of lizards here, iguanids and skinks. We'll also talk about Chameleonidae, which, as you probably already guessed, is chameleons, and the family Varanidae, which is monitor lizards, the largest, in terms of size of the animal, it's the largest group of lizards, and this group includes the famous Komodo dragon, the world's largest extant lizard. And we'll see examples of that. So I do want you to know these 6 family names, and we'll focus on the 4 here in Ohio, and I'll walk through and give you some examples from each of those families. Let's start with chameleons. Chameleonidae. These are a pretty diverse group of lizards restricted to tropical environments that have a lot of derived characteristics. And by that, I mean they have a lot of special traits that not a lot of other animals have. This includes what's called a zygodactylic feet. These are when their feet are essentially like mittens, where they have multiple finger bones encased in the same skin, basically. And so their hands are often have just 2 or 3 digits, and they form these nice mittens that they can grab branches to and climb. They're very often, but not exclusively, arboreal. Let me pause here. Sid, got a question? Jump in.
Yeah, sorry. Can you go back a slide real fast?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. These guys, chameleons, often have what's called casques, like these protrusions on their head. They have horns, they have crests, they have all kinds of crazy stuff going on. Recent research, and this is cool, I should bring this in the class, shows that if you shine a UV light on some chameleons, their bones actually glow under UV light. Wild stuff. They have these crazy extensile tongues with which they can catch prey, these ballistic tongues that shoot out quite extremely far distances. Of course, they're famous for their ability to change color quickly and easily, which they can do to camouflage themselves, pretty remarkably so. They have eyes that are on the lateral side of the head, so they have these very dorsolaterally, or excuse me, dorsoventrally compressed heads that are very like tall and thin. They have eyes on either side that can move independently in either direction. Many species also have prehensile tails, meaning that their tails can grip and grab and are useful when they're climbing. And they also have these very laterally flattened bodies. So you can't see it here. I should show you another guy. If you looked at him front on, you'd see a very skinny, kind of compressed body shape. So pretty unique group. The example I'm showing you here is the veiled chameleon. These guys are common in the pet trade, which is why I kind of picked to show it to you here. The scientific name is Cameleo calyptratus, but there's a huge diversity of these guys, including the world's smallest lizard is a species of chameleon that lives on the island of Madagascar. And very cool is an annual species, meaning that just like an annual plant, it completes its entire life cycle within a year, and there's never overlapping generations, meaning that each year babies hatch, they grow up, they mate, they become adults, they lay eggs. While those eggs are incubating, all of the adults die, and then those eggs hatch and the next generation goes on. And so there's never an overlap between generations of those guys. Really cool stuff, and again, speaks to the diversity of life history traits we find in reptiles.
Because their like lifespan is so short, do they like if you have them as a pet, will they also die within like a year? Or is it longer because it's like kind of like in captivity type thing?
Great question. So those guys do have an annual life cycle, so they would peter out within a year. They're in this case that's just kind of their natural lifespan. They're not dying because of predation or other things. I mean, of course they can die because of that, but they won't live for longer. They're really rare exclusive species, so I don't know if that species is anywhere in captivity. Maybe some zoos in Madagascar, but I'd be curious to know what it's like to raise those guys in captivity, but they would not live longer. It's just part of their natural lifespan, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting.
Great question. Questions rolling in on the chat. Bum, bum, bum. This file is a potential security issue. All right, Abby, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to download it anyway. I don't know what I'm downloading, but I'm going to open it and see what you sent us. Ah! This is great. Abby, thank you. There is what I believe is a full-grown adult of this species. I don't know the species name off the top of my head, but these are the tiny little guys that live in Madagascar. There's a clip from Life in Cold Blood where David Attenborough encounters one of these guys. Yeah, you can see they are ridiculously small and adorable. Cool. Thanks for sending that, Abby. I appreciate that. That is actually super handy to be able to do that in this online format. All right, let's talk about our next family, which is Iguanidae. So these are a very famous group of lizards, famous because they're common in the wild and also common in the pet trade. So the example species I'm showing you here is the species, challenging to remember this one, Iguana, the green iguana. Probably the most common lizard in the pet trade, if not reptile in the pet trade. They are native to the neotropics. However, they have very well established in Florida. You might have seen some news this past week about it raining iguanas in Florida. What happens is when there's a cold snap in Florida, these guys are arboreal primarily. They live up in trees, and they will literally get too cold to like hang on to their branch in these cold snaps, and they will fall out of the trees onto the ground. And you can, I guess, walk around Florida neighborhoods and see them on the ground. It's very controversial. They're big, beautiful animals, but they're also very pesty, invasive. They can actually be quite mean and large. They can inflict serious damage. They can whip their tail and bite, and they can injure humans or their pets. They poop massive poop. I mean, these guys take big poops, not as quite as big as the toad poop you heard about, but they can cause a lot of problems. And so there's a lot of places in Florida where they're not too happy that these guys have been established. Got some questions in the chat. Boop, 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 boop. Oh, okay. Yes, I should really clarify. Thank you to SK and Sam for asking these good clarifying questions. This annual life cycle of the chameleons, it's one specific species of chameleon. It is not that is not true for the entire family of lizards. It's just those tiny little Madagascar ones. I can't remember that species name off the top of my head. Other chameleons live for multiple years, lay multiple cutches, have overlapping generations, and are kind of more typical in that sense. The question is there a benefit to having that? I guess the benefit is, for whatever reason, over evolutionary time, it's become advantageous for the species as a whole to have these short lifespans. Now, I don't know the reason for this specifically with this species, but one could speculate that, for example, if you're in a place where there's limited resources, well, then you might not want overlapping generations, because then you have adults competing against their kids for those limited resources. There's other reasons why lifespans evolve to be really short as well, but I don't actually know, and I don't know if anybody knows the specifics for this little guy. All right, so I've got Ethan confirms this. Ethan, can you back that up with some research? Do you know of a specific research that has looked at that?
I know with, can you hear me all right?
Yep, we got you.
I know with my chameleons that I keep, I have a veiled and a panther chameleon. Well, I used to have veiled. But in their habitats, because the conditions were so harsh during one part of the year, it would be, so like the veiled, they can live for multiple years, but it's very often that you have it, they'll come to maturity in 1 year, lay their eggs and die the exact same. And it's so that you don't waste any resources like trying to survive multiple years, but also so you don't have any overlapping as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, this is a kind of a rare thing to talk about with vertebrates, but it's super common with insect species, right? There's tons of insect species that the adults and the babies never overlap for those exact reasons. Maybe the adults are incapable of surviving over winter or something like that, but the eggs can, and then so you lay the eggs in the fall, the eggs stay underground, stay safe in the winter, and then hatch out in the spring or something like that. Good. I see a hand up. I'm not sure whose it is. It just tells me hand up.
That would be me.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so for the iguanas in Florida, the green iguana, like, how did they get there and have such an established population? Because don't they have a pretty, like, long way to get from an adult and, like, have sexual maturity? So how did they, like, invade that fast?
Great question. And let me talk about, Florida is an ecological disaster, especially in terms of reptiles, depending on how you want to define the term disaster. What I mean specifically here is that there are dozens and dozens of non-native species that have become established in Florida. So Florida has a very kind of conducive climate for a lot of species. And the reason that they're so prominent there is because of the reptile pet trade. Very often what happens is these animals come in, they're shipped from all over the world to these big wholesalers where they keep these animals in places in Florida or other places. And then from there, they're shipped off to pet stores and things like that. And what happens is they get loose and then they establish. And what happens specifically in Florida has been documented is you have these giant facilities with, let's say, hundreds of green iguanas. And there's a storm or a hurricane, blows the building over, knocks the roof off, all of the iguanas get to run free and make more baby iguanas. And so we see examples of this with iguanas. We see examples with a number of anole species, the curly-tailed lizard, Burmese pythons, tegus. I mean, you name it, you can find this stuff in Florida. Monitor lizards, like it's pretty wild down there. And from what I understand is that, like, they're not uncommon. Like, you can walk around neighborhoods in Miami and see these really, like, big, rare lizards just cruising around. It sounds pretty fascinating. So yeah, Florida's Florida. So I think that answers your question, Sid. And so they do well. I mean, they thrive in these areas. There's not a lot of natural predators for these big old lizards, and so they're just rocking it down there. They're taking over the state. Let's see here from McKenna. For those interested, those tiny chameleons are from the genus. Oh, Brachysia. Yes, I'm so glad you said that. Yes, that is absolutely right. I love that the species names are Brachysia micra and Brachysia nana. That's great. Awesome. Thanks, McKenna. I appreciate you looking that up and informing us. Cool, cool. Okay, back to iguanas. I gave the example of iguana, the green iguana, not in Ohio. Another example species is Anolis sagriai, the brown anole. Another example of a lizard species that's not native to the US, but is very well established in Florida, in places in Alabama, and in the Southeast generally. And you can see these guys here, and they actually compete in many places with the anole species that is native to the US, the green anole. You've got the brown anole here, iguana here. Iguanas, the group iguanas is a very speciose group. Many of them have dorsal spines, so they kind of like what we think of as quote unquote dinosaur-like spines down their back. I have no idea what function those serve other than potential some kind of signaling. Iguanas that are in the same families, what am I trying to say? Lizards in this family that are in the same smaller group of lizards as with this green iguana are some of the biggest lizards around outside of monitors. We have, especially in some islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, you see some really large species. And many of these guys have a parietal eye, which is commonly called the third eye. It's a light sensing organ that has a thin scale over it right on the top of their head, with which they can detect shifts in light. So they can't see with the resolution of a normal eye, but they can detect shifts in light. Since one of the main predators of these guys is birds, that allows them to be able to detect when a bird or something might be coming from above. What these guys do, the green iguanas, actually are remarkable swimmers. And what they do in a lot of places in their native habitat is they hang out on these big branches over rivers. And if they're disturbed or a potential predator comes, they just drop off the branch into the water and swim away. It's really pretty neat to see that. And they're awesome swimmers. They tuck their legs back and their whole body kind of undulates through the water. All right, question in the chat. All right, go ahead.
What kind of bird eats that?
So not a full-grown green iguana, probably not too many birds, but when they're small, they do this. I should have specified. Yeah, and you see these, I'm sure everyone's seen these guys at the pet store. You can buy them as this little lizard. It's this big. They're like $15. They're adorable. You're like, oh, let's get a green iguana, but don't, unless you have like a room in your house to dedicate to it, because these guys get really big. The males especially can be super aggressive, and they can inflict some damage with their tail and their teeth. Having said that, they're also really cool. They're really smart. You can actually potty train them. I had friends that had a green iguana that free roamed in their house. Every morning they'd pick up the iguana, stick it in their bathtub. The iguana would take a big poop in the bathtub. They'd rinse it down the drain, and the iguana would hang out in the house for the rest of the day. So I see, yep. So yeah, and Sandy writes that they keep them in greenhouses. Exactly. Like you need a lot of space for these guys. It's not an animal you can keep in an aquarium. I saw Will with a hand up. Go ahead, Will.
You said you can get them at pet stores?
Oh, yeah.
What's funny was 2 years back at my hometown county fair, they had like the fishbowl game where you could win a green iguana. Yes,
I've seen that before too. It makes me vomit a little bit in my mouth when I see that. I'm not going to lie, knowing the fate of those animals. Yeah, it's well, later in class we might look at the reptile pet trade is a massively destructive force by and large. I'm making a generalization there. I'm not saying everyone that has a reptile pet is bad or anything like that. I have reptile pets. But the industry as a whole does not do much good for these animals. That's for sure, especially when you see them at carnivals. So those are two families in what we commonly call lizards that are not native to Ohio. We have the chameleons and the iguanids. We also have, oh wait, did I neglect? Well, I might need to come back to something. I think I forgot an important piece of information I might need to add to this, but we'll get there. We also have the family Geckonidae, or commonly called geckos. These guys are often found in the neotropical regions, but they can come up into kind of temperate desert regions. They're here in North America, in the western and southwest US. Many of them are nocturnal, and so they have these big old eyes so they can see better at night. There are diurnal and crepuscular species, crepuscular meaning that they come out at dawn and dusk. What's cool about these guys, among many things, it's a super diverse group of lizards again. What they're kind of famous for is that they have these specialized scales on their toes that enable them to cling via microscopic molecular forces on very smooth surfaces vertically and even kind of hang upside down. And so the way that these work is it's not actually sticky, it's not adhesive. These pads have, their toe pads have these kind of scales called lamellae. And on the lamellae are these hair-like structures, microscopic hair-like. So they're not hairs, but they look kind of like hairs. So we'll call them hair-like, and they're called setae. And these hairs, these hair-like structures, better said, are so fine that they actually bind at a molecular level. They bind to molecules in the surface of where they're adhering with something called van der Waals forces in a way that can allow these geckos to walk on sheer glass and things like that vertically and hang upside down. What is also notable about this group is that some of them don't have visible eyelids. They, like snakes, they have a clear scale over their eye, so they don't blink. You can often see some of them, like a pet leopard gecko, licking its own eye, which is always kind of fun. Some of them can close their eyes as well. The example species I have here is Gecko Gekko. Notice that the genus name is spelled different than the species name, even though they're pronounced the same. Sometimes binomial nomenclature doesn't make a lot of sense. This is the Toki Gekko, fairly common in the pet trade, although I don't know why. They're nasty and loud. They're cute. I actually had one as a pet when I was a little kid. I don't know what my parents were thinking, but they're pretty common in the pet trade. They get pretty large as well. Here in Ohio, we do have a species of gecko that has recently been reported, and that is the Mediterranean gecko, Hemidactylus tursicus. These guys are very successful colonizers across the globe. They are from the Mediterranean area, as you might guess from their common name, but they are established across much of the southeastern US and southwest actually too. And they're kind of moving upward, and there's been a few documented sightings here in Ohio. I've heard stories that they're in Cincinnati, but I haven't seen confirmed reports of that. I've also looked on iNaturalist recently, and there's a couple sightings of these guys, including one in Columbus. So soon, coming to an Ohio town near you is the widely cosmopolitan Mediterranean gecko, Hemidactylus tursicus. Sorry, can you stay with this slide, but just the text? Oh yeah, go back to the text on the slide, sure. There's our Toki Gekko back there.
Dr. Gangloff?
Yes.
You had said when we were going over the different families that Iguanidae was one that had a species in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering which species was that?
Yeah, do you remember when I said, oh, I forgot some important information? I'm going to have to go back and look at that. So the fence lizard, Scoloporus undulatus, is in that family as well. And I apologize, I thought I had the slide for that, and it looks like I didn't. So I will add that information later, Ethan. Yeah, you're right. That was my bad. The fence lizard.
It's the eastern fence lizard, right?
That is correct, yep. I'm going to pause for just 1 second. Bear with me. I'm just going to skip ahead on some slides real quick and just kind of assess where we're at and what time it is. I'm just pondering what I want to cover today and what I want to leave till Monday. Okay, I think this is actually a good spot. I'm going to finish up talking about lizards. I've still got a handful of groups to cover. But I think I'm at the point where we've been lecturing enough online, and I want to transition a little bit, and that's fine. We can finish this up on Monday, and that'll actually give me a chance to add the Scoloporus slide as well. I would like to do this. We've been here in front of your computers for the better part of an hour. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute stretch break, and then we'll come back and transition Well, maybe we'll finish lizards. Maybe we'll do our other activity. I need to ponder that. But this will give me 5 minutes to do that and give everyone a chance to take a break. So take 5. My clock here says 3:01. So let's go ahead and meet just at 3:05. Sound good? All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back in a moment. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good, nice stretch break there. What I would like to do is to pause our lecture on lizards here. We have a few more families to work through in favor of transitioning to our other activity. And we can finish that up, finish up our lizard families on Monday of next week, which should work out just fine for our kind of class schedule. So before we make that transition, I just want to see what questions you have about anything we've covered today. Before we transition and talk about those summaries that you read for class today. Okay, so let's transition and let's talk about the summary. So for class today, you read an example of some summaries of research papers. And so just a little bit of background. These summaries were in a journal called the Herpetological Review. This is a journal that comes out 4 times a year, and it's published by the Society for the Study of Amphibians and Reptiles. So specifically a journal for herps, right? What they do is they include summaries of recent research on reptiles and amphibians from other journals that aren't specific to reptiles and amphibians, so that readers of their journal get a nice summary of what is going on. I really like these summaries because it gives you the important information about work that's going on without necessarily needing to read a whole bunch of long papers. And it's also, they highlight kind of some interesting studies. I also think it's a great model for how to distill important information from a research paper. And so with that in mind, you'll be working towards creating your own research summaries based on articles that you read in the coming weeks and throughout the semester, in fact. Now, you'll notice when you read those papers, or read those article summaries for today, that you might recognize some of the author names for those summaries. Those are, in fact, a number of OWU students who were in the herpetology class 2 years ago, and you will, like them, have the option of submitting your research summary for publication in the journal if you want to do that. It's kind of a fun way to get your name in print, and also just a great way to kind of take what we're doing in class and put it into like this, apply it somewhere and actually have it published instead of just being a class assignment. So we're starting that off today. Your reading today was to just read those articles and come ready to talk about them, which I hope you did. There's some really interesting studies going on there as well. And what I'm going to do is split you up into small groups of 3 or 4 people. And you're going to work to identify the major components of a manuscript summary. So for example, you're going to make a list of important things that are in a manuscript summary. So the first example that comes to mind is the name of the species that's studied. You might also include the geographic location, maybe a little bit about the methods, and so on and so on. Your job is to make that list of information that's kind of included commonly in a summary. In other words, looking at a research paper, what's important? If you're summarizing that, what kind of information do you want to put into that summary? You're then going to take that list of important components of a summary, and you're going to pick 3 of the summaries that you read, and you're going to name those components. So for example, if one of the components you include is the name of the species, well, for summary number 1, you're going to include the name of that species. If another important component is the geographic location of the study, then you include the geographic location of that study. And you'll be working in groups to do this together, and you will be doing 3 of those summaries. That the PDF that you read for today included probably 8 or 9 of those. You don't have to do all of them, just 3. So that is the plan. You'll pick 3 of those and list the components. To do that and help keep you organized, I made a Google Sheet that you can use as a template, what you can do, and I'll put this link in the chat as well. Just kidding, it's not working. If you go to this sheet, you can then save your own copy of it and use that as a template. you'll notice on the sheet that I put a place for your names. Here, actually, let me pull it up and show you. You'll notice here that you can put your group members' names here in yellow, and then down the side here, you can list the components. I got you started because this will be one in all of them, the name of the species or the taxa that was studied. And then for your first study, you could put the title here and then list all of those components. And I suspect you'll have somewhere between 5 and 10 components that are essential. Now, if you're trying to log in and you don't have access, you should, are you logged in with your OWU credentials? Those of you not getting access? Hold on, sorry about that. Try it now. Sorry about that. Yep, I see you're all logged in there. Okay, great. Okay, I didn't have it set up properly. So what I'll do is I'll break you into small groups. And what time is it now? I think we'll go ahead and set give you 20 minutes to start working on it. I suspect it's going to take a little bit of time. You're going to want to work through those and figure out how it's going. I'll check in with the groups, and then we'll take it from there and see if you need more time or if you want to complete this outside of class time. That's fine too. So before I break you into those small groups, what questions do you have about what the expectation is right now? Oh, I didn't mention this is worth 4 class points as well. And so I'll be able to see who did each one by the names on the spreadsheet, obviously. Any questions before I split you up?
Can you go back to the QR code?
Yes, I hit it here, yeah. And I put the link in the chat as well if it's easier to use the link.
Oh.
Good, got it. Any other questions? All right, give me 1 second. I'm going to set this for 20 minutes. And I'm going to allow you to return to the main session at any time. That way, if you do have a question, you can come back and ask me or raise your hand and I will find you. I'll bounce around to each group and check in and say, hey, go for it. Alan, are you able to get where you need to go? Alan, you there? All right, good, Alan. Okay. All right, welcome back, everyone. From what I saw as I bounced around those rooms, all the groups were making good progress and things were coming along. Go ahead and do this for me in the chat. Just type in one number that corresponds to the number of minutes your group would need to kind of satisfactorily finish this assignment. Just real quick. Okay, I'm seeing between 5 and 10. Okay, that's going to work out perfectly. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give the final announcements in the wrap up of class now. And then I will send you back into those groups. We've only got about 15 minutes left of, no, I guess class goes till 4. You've got a good 20 minutes left of class time. And then I will let you work in those groups as you would like. And then when you're done, you can just zoom out and be done. Then what I'll do is Monday in class, I'll give you a chance to just check in with your group for a few minutes, make sure everything looks good before you submit the assignment. That way you can finish up on Zoom today. you can have a chance if you want to take things away and work on it individually, and then you also have a chance to make sure it's all cool before you submit with your group. And that way I think that'll work best for everybody and give you a chance to check in about that Monday before you submit. It's always nice to make sure everybody in the group can look over the assignment before it's turned in. So with a show of, I guess you can use those little emoji thingies. Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if that sounds like an okay plan for you and your group.
Quick question.
Yes, please.
Sorry if I missed this, but how will we submit it on Monday?
I didn't say that, and I apologize. One of the groups asked me about that. Is you'll just share the document with me, and then
Okay.
I'll have access to it, and I can look at those. So I'm seeing lots of thumbs up. Okay, that sounds like the plan for this assignment then. So let me just give a few wrap-up announcements here, and then you'll have a chance to connect with your group and finish that up if you want to do that now. And you can take as little time or as much time as you need. Before I do that, any other questions? Oh, I see a snake. There's a snake emoji you can do?
You can do any of the emojis. You just have to hit like the 3 dots.
Really?
Lets you do any of them. If you have a Mac.
Oh my God, my Zoom meetings have just become way more fun. Okay, great. An octopus. Wait, SK. Octopus, really? Like an invertebrate in herpetology class? Oh, we'll talk later. All right, go ahead, Ethan. You have a serious question. I see some turtles, frog. Go ahead.
Wait, who? Me? Oh. My question was, the video that we were watching Monday, are we finishing that in class? Do you want us to finish that by yourself, or what are we doing?
Alan, you and I are on the same wavelength. So, to answer Alan's question, we were watching the video Land Invaders, and you're answering some questions in Blackboard. What I'm going to do is exactly what Alan just said. Is I'm giving you a link, and you can watch the rest of it before class on Monday. There's 2 assignments on your class program for Monday. That's to finish the video and get the reflection in. We have about 25 minutes left in the video. And then to complete a survey that will take you probably 1 minute to just give me some information about what of the mud puppy field trips you plan on attending next week. As a reminder for that, actually here I put this reminder on there. This is due before class on Monday, the Life in Cold Blood Land Invaders episode. So remember, these questions are in Blackboard. You can watch the video. I set up the link in your program to take you to the spot in the video where we left off even. So you can pick up watching the frog save all its little babies from a puddle drying out. It's actually, the sequence that we were just at is like one of my favorites. I love it. It's great. So enjoy that. Also, as a reminder, our mud puppy trip will be next week, Tuesday night and Wednesday during the day. I sent out an announcement asking if any of you were qualified, or whatever the term is, qualified to drive the van on Tuesday night. As of right now, we might not have a second van driver, so I might need to limit the Tuesday night outing to just 11 students, plus if anybody wants to drive on their own. So please do complete that survey in the program for Monday. That will tell me who's planning on doing what, so we can arrange transportation accordingly. And again, if you missed that announcement, if anyone is certified to drive the van, that's what I'm looking for, certified to drive the van and is willing to do so for Tuesday's trip, please let me know, but no obligation. That's all I've got for class. I'm going to send you back to your breakout rooms. You can finish this up. We'll pick things up Monday. We'll give a short amount of time in your breakout rooms or with your the people in your breakout rooms in actual physical space to debrief this assignment and get it in. We'll finish talking about lizards, and then we've got some other activities in preparation for a mud trippy. That sounds actually fun. I'm going to start combining the mud puppy trip into just mud trippy. Could get in trouble for that maybe. Anyway, dude, it's going to be mud trippy. All right, I need to log off because I'm losing my mind here. Everyone have a fantastic snowy couple days. Stay warm, stay safe, and I will look forward to seeing everyone back in person in class on Monday. I'll stop recording here, but if you have any questions for me. Oh, I see a couple questions in the chat, actually, before we go. African bullfrogs are metal. Oh, they are. They're totally. I love that. And then I've got a couple questions here, so I will stay online and happy to chat with anyone. Otherwise, see you Monday. Great. I'm going to split you into your breakout rooms, and let me just do this. Put you back, but feel free to log off whenever you are done